and people have gone with it. Now, there's been a lot of scholars along the way. If it had a major problem, you would think it would have gotten more critique until the last 50 years, like it has. They're asking if there's any place in the Hebrew grammar for what's called the gap theory or restitution theory. In Hebrew, there's not even a consideration. It doesn't hold any water. And again, I don't know of any Hebrew scholar that's going to go there. Without the New Testament, you wouldn't find the Trinity in the Old Testament. Now, some people take the Trinity and they go back and they say, oh, there's 27 verses in the Old Testament that show or they prove the Trinity. And that's not really good Hebraic thinking, I guess is the best way to say it.
Hey everyone, this is what your pastor didn't tell you. Today I'm on with Dr. Will Ryan of Expedition 44. We're going to be talking about the gap theory, young earth creationism, and things in the original Hebrew that we don't see in typical English translations of Genesis 1:1-3. Dr. Ryan, how are you doing today? And can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Pretty good, Zach. Thanks for having me on your show today. I really appreciate it. I'm excited about this. You've kind of asked me to come on and talk about early Genesis. It doesn't get much earlier, Genesis 1. And so this is just one of my passions in life. I've spent a lot of time studying ancient Near East thought, Genesis, things like that. And I mean, a lot of people love to golf or play basketball or whatever, and honestly, like, this is what I love to do, especially like early Genesis. It's kind of my cup of tea. So anyway, you kind of gave me a little introduction. I'll tell you a little bit more. I started out my life, I've always been a fervent follower of Christ. My parents were both immersed in the church, but this makes me sound like I'm from the 1700s. But my dad was a itinerant pastor, would go from place to place and fill the pulpit in the Christian church. And so I kind of grew up churching it that way. When I was in high school, I went to this huge church, and they went through like 3 or 4 pastors in 2 years, youth pastors, and then decided they weren't doing it. And so when I was like a sophomore in high school, I kind of ended up becoming like the youth pastor of our church. I look back and think it was just crazy. How would a big church ever let that happen like that? But it was just super awesome. From there, I went to Moody, which is funny because I'm not dispensational. My parents weren't dispensational. Moody's kind of the dispensational hub of the world, but it's also kind of referred to as the Harvard of Bible colleges, and that's what I loved about it. I wanted to kind of get the best Bible education I could. I didn't see the path in front of me that I've ended up on. I was planning on becoming either a youth pastor or a Christian school teacher, but I got sucked in by John Walton. If you follow him, you might know that he was at Moody in the 90s, and I just was mesmerized by what he would bring out of the Bible. So I took every class I could, established a great relationship with him, and after that, I started teaching at a Christian school up in Wisconsin, and attended University of Wisconsin, and started getting, I just love learning, so started getting a pile of master's degrees, in which case eventually I enrolled in their PhD program for classical and ancient Near East studies. And it was a awesome venture. I stayed there till 2016 when they closed the Lubar Institute for Study of Abrahamic Religions, which I was really close into that. And so I kind of left and switched gears, and ended up landing at Covenant Theological Seminary. I had some good friends that were involved there, and I had started doing some teaching there, and I ended up getting a THD from them. And I've been there for about 7 or 8 years. I'm currently the head of theology and biblical studies there. About 3 years ago, I started a YouTube channel where I'm the founder, but I invited a good friend of mine, Matt Mazakis, and that's called Expedition 44. We just in the last few months passed 100,000 subscribers, so that was pretty awesome. And I've written a whole bunch of works. Currently I've got a book series I'm in the middle of. This year I released the first of it. It's the whole series called This Is the Way. And the first book in that series has been out for several months now, and it's been fairly successful. Hit some top 50 on Amazon, Christian theology. I didn't even know there were 50 theology books on Amazon. But anyway, hit something like that. The next one is This Is the Way of Covenant Discipleship, and that comes out the first of the year, so I'm excited for that release. I live in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, 4 boys, involved in a pretty good sized church here. And then I'm also part of what I would call a micro church, which is our little community of our best friends in life and their kids and everything else. And we have regular get-togethers. We kind of all homeschool, so our kids live in each other's houses, and we go on vacations together, and everything is just God all the time. We also have Bible studies and open praise and worship teaching sessions where we'll invite the community and things like that. So anyway, just a super fun little community that I'm part of between Covenant Theological Seminary and our church and everything else we got going on there.
I'm sure it was a ton of fun being basically mentored by John Walton there. But everyone, make sure to go like and subscribe to their channel. Check out their videos. A lot of great stuff. I spent a lot of time listening to their stuff. Also make sure to check out their books, Dr. Ryan's books. They're really good stuff here. Strongly recommend. They'll be linked in the description. All right. So, can you give us your, just how do you translate Genesis 1:1-3? Hey chat, subscribing to our YouTube channel allows us to help our watchers understand the Bible better. Thanks to your help, we have already reached thousands of people in their walk with Christ. If you'd like to help further our efforts, tap the subscribe button, which will allow us to reach even more people.
You forgot to tell them to turn on bell notifications.
Wait, they have to subscribe and click a bell now?
That's a great question. And I love your channel because it seems like you kind of got stuck on Genesis. And this is how I fell in love with the Bible, is I got stuck on Genesis. I went to Moody Bible Institute, honestly, to play soccer. I went there to play soccer, and I had to make my classes all work on Tuesday and Thursday. So I stumbled on John Walton, who they almost didn't let me take his class. I think he's all level 3 classes, but I needed it to make my schedule work. So luckily I met him my first semester there, and I literally fell in love with Genesis. And that, I thought I was passionate about God and the Bible before this, but I really got into the Word of God. And theology is almost a bad word today, but I fell theologically in love with the Word, and it was like a tractor beam that just totally sucked me in. And so when I come back to Genesis 1, I come back to my first love, I might. So you had Dr. Henry Sun on your show, and I got to confess, I've never heard of him before, but I listened to the whole thing. I think it was a 2-hour video, and he seems like a guy I could totally hang out with. And I thought he did a great job of laying out the construct argument for Genesis 1:1. I loved how in-depth he got. I mean, you just don't see a lot of people dive that far in depth. And if I remember, he's part of a Presbyterian church, I think. And I don't know a whole lot of Presbyterians that necessarily go that deep. So I love this guy. I kind of like, what he did. He made what I thought was a very solid case for his view, and for the most part, like I said, I totally agree. I kind of get there a different way, and you'll see some of that today. But I guess at this point, there's going to be times in this video where you might just need to pause it. I can't. I've kind of got an ADD problem, but I can't just watch any of these videos. I have to have 3 computers in front of me, and the regular Bible and a Hebrew Bible and all this stuff, and I'm hitting pause and taking notes and doing this. So I'm just going to invite your viewers. We kind of call that an Expedition 44 view, that you just got to hit pause and do this. So this is your first moment that if you haven't watched Zach's earlier video with Dr. Henry's son, I would first tell you to probably stop and go watch that one first. It's worth every bit of the 2 hours it takes, and then come back and watch this one. So hit pause, jump over there, then come back to this one. So here's the thing that where I differ from him a little bit is Genesis 1 through 3 isn't simply cut and dry. I'm going to say it's extremely complicated from any interpretational perspective. You can't be on one side or the other and not think it's complicated. So no matter where you land on this, you're going to have to do some work. And I would say that's an unusual part of the text. There's a lot of texts out there that if you, let's say you lean Calvinist, they're going to be easier to work through, where if you're on the other side of the fence, maybe like a total free will person or something like that, that some texts come easy, some of them come with a lot of work. What might be a lot of work for somebody on this view might not be coming from this camp, et cetera, et cetera. And it doesn't matter what camp you come or what view you represent. Genesis 1, particularly 1 through 3, is just hard. It's difficult. You're going to have to kind of come into it with an unbiased, open mind and not be afraid to do some work no matter where you're coming from. And I hate to say it, but not very many people can approach a text that way. Almost everybody has some kind of predetermined bias or, something that they already believe that they want to hold on to or something like that. And so right away, I'm just going to try to get everybody into the mode of coming to this video, of laying all those things aside and just acting like this is the first time you've ever heard this before. And so there's basically two main interpretations of this text. Now, there's a whole bunch of other interpretations in between and, various parts of these two views. But for the most part, we have a traditional interpretation, and then we have what I already referred to as a construct interpretation. And I'm not going to spend a lot of nerd language time here because I could argue for either interpretation and likely convince you. So from the beginning, I'm going to tell you that I pretty much totally agree with Dr. Sun's take on the text. Again, I'm going to get there a little bit different than he does, but him and I are going to land in the same place. Now, I think how we get there is different. One is because I come from a perspective of not necessarily caring which way I go with this text. I come from a place of just saying, I just want to know the truth. I don't have any denominational ties or this or that or anything like that. I just want to see how it fits into the lens that I'm doing. So one of my gifts in life is to interpret new nerd theology language to the average person. So I'm going to try to just break this down a little bit for us that we can all understand. So if you know Hebrew, what I'm going to say in the next few minutes is pretty basic. If you don't, well, you don't. It's kind of all Greek, but it's Hebrew to you, and you're not really going to get it. So this is hard in that a lot of people ask me, well, should I go learn Hebrew? And my usual answer is Greek, yes, Hebrew, maybe not, because there's just a lot going on in the Hebrew language with the grammar and everything else. It's significantly more difficult. And I'll have to say, there are some great helps out here today that have really only been around in the last few years. And so, I don't know if you're how far into this you are. Most people that are really into it are going to have Logos software. You might, if you're in this, the Logos dispute going on, even in the other thing. So maybe you have 10 platinum, you put your $1,800 in, and you're going to have that in front of you. I think Dr. Henry's son kind of gave a little shout out to the netbible.org. I think it's amazing. It's obviously not flawless. I have issues with it. I'll use some of their stuff today. But there's a lot going on there. I also just want to say it's worth stepping back sometimes and just kind of logically analyzing what you heard. So, in terms of laying out my view in Genesis 1 through 3, I'm not going to necessarily convince anybody of anything. I don't care what view most viewers end up taking on this. And to be honest, like, I'm just not dogmatic here. You can go one way or the other, and I've got my views and you got yours. And part of the reason why I'm like that with this text is that I don't personally have anything on the line that I can't live with. And so some people are really careful on this text because they're afraid it's going to open up some evolutionary thought and maybe, some open theist ideas and things like that. And I kind of gave up worrying about stuff like that a long time ago. So for me, even though I love this text, it's not necessarily at the point that I'm falling on the sword over. Everything I've arrived at here, I've arrived at just because I think it's the best view. And I have to come back to Zach and say, Zach, I've respected what I've watched on your channel with you because it seems like you take a very similar approach to it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in my opinion, a lot of times in these questions, it's not terribly clear either way. And I mean, if you're concerned about truth, then it's easy to say I don't know, and I might have to look further. And maybe if I keep looking, I can find the answer, but maybe not just yet.
There you go. Good perspective. I love it. So first thing you want to do is maybe hit pause and go collect your stuff. If you've got a couple computer screens or a Bible or something, be there. But the first place I'll have you do it, I don't know if you're familiar with an interlinear, but if you just type in Genesis 1:1 and the word interlinear into your computer, the first thing that's going to come up is probably the Bible Hub interlinear for that, and just click it. And as you do that, you're going to be able to kind of see the Hebrew transliteration, the Strong's numbers, the literal interpretations there. And that's the best place to start, in my opinion. You can kind of click around, see how many times these words were used. You can get the parts of speech. So even though you don't know Hebrew, you actually probably know more Hebrew in this than scholars did 50 years ago just by having this tool at your fingertips. So that's the first place I start, and then you can hop around there, and I'm going to make some references to some of that so you can track along a little bit. So opening words of the Bible, Barashit, Genesis 1:1, the ba is the end there, the Rashiyit is the beginning. Could be translated two ways, as we started out saying. The traditional way is more of a standalone, Genesis 1:1 as an absolute statement. It's grammatically independent. That means it's not subordinate on anything else, but grammatically independent to what comes after that. And so in the beginning, God, that's Elohim, created the heavens and the earth, period. That's kind of ex nihilo thinking out of nothing. So the first traditional interpretation I'm actually really not going to spend a lot of time on because it doesn't leave much to be argued about. And honestly, that's my favorite thing about the traditional interpretation is it's just easy. It's simple. It reads simply in English. It can read simply interpreting it that way into Hebrew. It's just most of the time, I think simple, plain reading is better. The other big reason to go this way, and I'll get into this more, is it just has a huge precedence in history. And so translators for years and years have just translated it that way. So I actually do like the traditional idea. Now, being a Hebrew language person, I that's where I start, and I kind of get a couple hangups. So the next view, which is the view that Dr. Henry's son holds and I hold, and I'm going to just throw this out here, most Hebrew scholars I know would also take this view, and it's called more of a modern view, a construct view. It's dependent, subordinate statement. It's a little rare and a little different. I'm going to get into that, but quite acceptable. It's not like, doesn't present a huge argument, and it's found numerous other places in the Bible, extra biblical material, but it could be translated in the beginning of or when beginning of. Now we're going to get into all this. So as you look at it that way, it's just pretty kind of cut and dry. Now, construct, I'm going to describe a little bit different than Henry's son did, but differently but the same. So most of you that watch that, if you tracked with him, I think you'll track with this too. In Hebrew, we have what's called a construct, maybe a dependent. It's a relative clause, two-word construct, whole phrase, definite. It kind of leans on the next verse. So kind of when you read it, you get the when, in, and that's prepositional. That's, you might have learned this when you were like in junior high, about, above, across, after, against, among. So in Hebrew, this is going to be a little harder because sometimes those are like basically implied, or we don't necessarily know which one of those prepositions it's kind of leaning or hinting, and we have to figure that out. And this is one of the reasons why I love Hebrew, because it's a little bit of a puzzle that way. And so when you get here, you have when or in the beginning, Elohim creates the heaven and the earth. And so in English, that would read, when God began to create the heavens and the earth, it was formless. So what this does is kind of might, and I say might because there's, again, different views here, but it assumes the matter is already there. And whether you want to go chaotic on that or not, like there's different views. So in beginning of, the word isn't actually in the text, bara, God created. Hebrew reads the verb first, then the subject, et or va-et, that announces the direct object. He creates, well, what does he create? The heavens and the earth. So you might recognize, I think this audience is tracking this way. That comes from the hot, the beginning of it, the attachment to it. And you might remember this, and like every time people like start attending seminary, they kind of learn the Hasatan verbiage of, what's a proper name and what isn't a proper name. And so, Hasatan isn't necessarily a proper name, but it's the description of a challenger, the adversary. I don't call myself the Ryan, but I might say I'm a theologian. That's the same way this text is working out here. So you have to think that way too. So if you're looking at your interlinear, you can see that how that Hebrew attaches things to the front. Those are called morphemes. And so the barashiat, the ba in the front, Dr. Henry's son kind of pointed that out, but it's opening words. And then you have your consonants on the main line. Then you might see some dots underneath in Hebrew. Those were punctuation. Those are added many years later by the Masoretes, Middle Ages. And then you get to Elohim, and Elohim is interesting. We might get to diving into that a little bit more, but it's grammatically plural. So normally when you get the Elohim that's grammatically plural in the rest of the Bible, it kind of talks about gods, like multiple gods. And sometimes I even argue that Elohim is like the worst name to actually use for our God, Yahweh, even though the Bible uses it. And that's why it's acceptable to use it, because our Bible uses it to talk about Yahweh in terms of Elohim. But it often might refer to demonic spirit beings or false gods or something like that. So you just have to kind of be paying attention to the rest of the text when you see Elohim to kind of wonder what it's talking about. And so this is one of those questions, like whenever I see Elohim, I have to say, well, what Elohim is it talking about? And so being that this one's grammatically plural, but there's a twist on this too, I automatically am going to go with kind of like a Michael Heiser Deuteronomy 32 divine council view on it. So could it be the Trinity? That's what a lot of people, I think the traditional view is to kind of look at it as traditional. And most tried and true Old Testament Hebrew scholars, definitely the rabbinical folks, aren't going to let you go there. They're going to say that the text has to make sense to the audience that it was intended for. Like if it couldn't have meant something to that audience, then the primary interpretation can't be taken that way too. And so, of course, this is a Genesis 1:27 conversation too, but for the most part, if you're thinking like a Hebrew, thinking as if this was written to you and you're reading it, your understanding of the text right away, they had no understanding of the Trinity in the Old Testament, so they're not going there. They're just going to read into it as, is there more than one God? And this is where you can kind of get into, are there two Godheads? And you might follow this in the Old Testament, thinking that most of the Old Testament people kind of thought there was a Yahweh one and a Yahweh two, whether that was the Spirit of the Lord or the angel of the Lord. That's a whole nother video, but it's a great video at the same time. And so Elohim is kind of the plural of El, or God. You might remember Bene Ha Elohim. You kind of think of this as Genesis 6 or sons of God, or, original beings. But by the way, the sons, it's not gender, it's just grammatical. But that's the kind of thinking, or the place that your head should go when you read Elohim here, is that what's going on. So I kind of take it as there's an assembly. There are so many times in the Bible where you see God sitting on a throne, and he's almost always surrounded by, an assembly of spiritual beings. And so whether you want to look at that as, choir worshiping him, or just spiritual beings, messengers, things doing this or that, whatever, but there's almost always something around them. And so it seems like God is kind of pulling in those around him, including them in this creation. But as I said, this is still God singularly, and that's where it comes back to the grammar, singularly doing this action. And so he's partnering with, whether it be the divine council or just those praising him around him, but the work itself is clearly him. And so we get to heaven, skies. It's masculine, plural. I'm moving on here if you didn't catch that. And again, if you're thinking in the way this was written, heaven, heavens, it's kind of besides the point. It's just the spiritual domain. So they're not looking at this the way that we think, in like a more of a Greek way of thinking of, is he talking about the skies? Is he talking about this heaven place that we'll go? Is he talking? It was just kind of all pushed in together. It was just the space up there, and that's where the heavenly beings kind of resided or came from. So that's the way they're thinking. One of the things about Hebrew is you try not to read too much into anything. Kind of take the basic interpretation. And so, that you get to the wav or the vav, and usually that means and, but it can be but or now. It can kind of act like prepositions that way, and that you can insert several words. So in Hebrew, you just kind of have to kind of come up with the adjoining word that you think works best. And this is why Hebrew is complicated, because it isn't so cut and dry. So oftentimes, if I kind of turn and grab like a Hebrew Bible, and I kind of go through this and I'm start to read it to you or something like that, I'm going to be reading it, and I'm going to kind of get to a place and kind of go, but I'm going to stumble around a little bit, because you kind of have to figure out the text in order to like make sense of it. So you're kind of working on a puzzle as you go. And sometimes those puzzles take a lot of sitting down and working through. And this is one of them, where perhaps the small words of interpretation could be important. So all that aside, what do I think is like the best interpretation? I would kind of go, and this is going to sound funny to people because it gets a little literal Hebrew, and you might have heard this interpretation before. I think it was Benner takes this one, and John Walton's alluded to it if he doesn't take it. But think about it this way. In the beginning period that God created the heavens and the earth, and I would put a parenthesis here, the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. comma, and the wind of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. I would kind of put my parenthesis back there. God said, let light be. So in my mind, looking at it in Hebrew, doing a little bit of translation, transliteration work, looking at what I think the text best says, you'll notice that's a construct form of one sentence all the way through. Zach, how we doing so far?
Okay, all right. So I'm missing something. So you're gonna have to explain for me. All right. So I was thinking you were thinking translate it. When God began to create, but it sounds like you're taking it a little different approach. So can you slow it down? Tell us what's the difference there?
All right, that's a great question. So, let's do this. Let's kind of get into the text a little bit more and kind of compare a relative clause compared to the traditional view, and just kind of go through a little bit and really kind of jump in there. So again, before I do this, I feel like I've got to give almost like another little introduction. So this is going to be a long video. It seems like I think that your watchers are used to long videos from what I've seen on here, but like, this is just something that I think your head and your heart got to be in the right spot. And so again, I'll just give you a little introduction before we get this. I always just want the truth. I want the best biblical interpretation with the complete lens of Scripture. So when we sit down and go through this text, like my goal is to not leave a rock unturned. Like I'm not afraid to like hit any part of this. So how do I get to what I just said? How do some of the best scholars in the world get to that interpretation, which you won't really find necessarily in any given Bible? That's something that all these scholars kind of got together and said, yeah, if we were doing it, this is what we would do. So some are going to argue for a modern view because it better agrees with science. Personally, I don't care much about science. Some do, some love it, some that's their goal, is to make science and the Bible agree, and I respect that, but that's not me. I'm only into the kingdom of Jesus, and I could care less what the world thinks about my God, my relationship, the way it fits into science, anything like that. Now, I shouldn't say care less. I mean, the goal is to bring those into our kingdom, so I do sort of care about that, but I'm not losing sleep about it. So this whole argument doesn't necessarily concern me as much as it might concern others that have to prove something along the way. So that's where I'm at. So again, this isn't like a huge issue to me. I could spend an hour and probably convince you of either view. And I do this a lot. I at Covenant Theological Seminary, where I'm the head of biblical studies and theology, this is one of the ways that we not only teach regularly, but we encourage the students to look at text regularly. We often ask them to defend the other side of the view. And so on our Expedition 44 website, I do this a lot. I'm a tried and true egalitarian, for instance, and one of our favorite videos is entitled "If I Were a Complementarian," where I give what I think are the best views or reasons to be a complementarian. I've got so many complementarian friends that like go to that video and go, oh my goodness, like you laid that out better than I could have, and I love that kind of thing. And so we recently did one where our co-host Matt was on the line with another Dr. Steve Castle, and they have kind of opposing views. One kind of has more of a governmental liberty view where we need to be influential in every, like it's almost like a Seven Mountain Mandate, perspective, where we need to be influential in every place. And Matt's kind of more of an Essenes view of kind of almost checked out, doesn't want to have anything to do with a government that doesn't honor the Lord or anything like that. And like, I love mediating those kind of things. And so in a way, I'm going to kind of mediate this text a little bit and kind of give both sides somewhere to go. So you kind of get into, some different things here, but my view on Genesis stuff, and I'm just going to start out by saying this, is it doesn't bother me when people might go, somewhat evolutionary with it or something like that. My view on it is you have to always bring it back to God. If you're going to bring it back and you said God in his supreme majesty, throne, sovereignty is going to choose to give it this way, if you come back to him doing the work, I don't particularly care the how and the why, although I'm mesmerized by it. I find it's interesting. But as long as we come back to giving God the credit, like that's really where I land, is I want everything to point back to God. And in the Old Testament, New Testament, I'd say it in a sense then would point to Jesus. So that being said, let's consider both views. As I've been alluding to, this text is complicated. So both are going to kind of seem to have problems that you have to work through. So most traditional interpretations are going to have issues. In fact, Zach, that's pretty much what your channel is about, is, the things your pastor never told you are problems in the text. Now, I truly believe that all problems in the Bible have solutions. I think that the Bible is just an incredible inspired word of God that way, that nothing's ever scared me away that I couldn't come to a viable understanding if I put the time in to kind of work through it and understand it. Now, it might have taken me years. Some of this I'm still on a lifelong pattern of, but like that's what I love about the Bible the most, is getting into it that way. So, best reason to go traditional, I've already implied, is because it's tradition. Tradition means something. So for the better part of 1,500 years, this text has been translated traditionally, and people have gone with it. Now, there's been a lot of scholars along the way. If it had a major problem, you would think it would have gotten more critique until the last 50 years, like it has. You'd think for the last 1,500 years, it would have been critiqued. Now, some are going to argue it has. So I'm going to say the last 1,500 years, there's a huge Greco-Roman influence that kind of pushes us this way. And even in our culture, the great American evangelical church, like we're still heavily into Greek Platonic thinking, you might say. So there's still some of that. But from the Second Temple period all the way to our culture today, Genesis 1:1 has been thought of in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Even the earliest example, which I'd say the Septuagint, and you look at John 1:1, which again we might get to. You could argue that too, and again we might get to that. But even church fathers, Aquila, that's 140, Theodotion, that's 2nd century. You can go through this. The Aramaic Targums, the Latin Vulgate, all of this stuff, all of the translations, and most modern translations today go this way. There's a lot riding on the traditional view, again, simply because it's traditional, of telling us we need to stick this way. If you stick this way, no one's ever really going to argue with you. They're just going to be like, yeah, that's the traditional view. I might not hold to it, but an awful lot of people do. It's not going to necessarily get you in trouble. So in Hebrew, and definitely in English, it reads more simply this way. Now, Hebrew people are going to argue with that, and I'm going to argue with it later, but you don't have to do a lot of spiritual gymnastics, and generally I like that approach. In the plain reading of the text, you just kind of get there. Now, the in the beginning part is interesting. So, Zach, I'll remember when Dr. Henry's son got to this. I think he was going through what I call the 26:1, 27:1, 28:1 in Jeremiah. And you actually kind of stopped for a minute and questioned him on this, which I don't know how. I don't know if you really knew what you were doing, but that was actually like a incredibly smart or well played moment that you had, in that if there was any breakdown in what he was saying, this is where the breakdown probably would have been found. So in Hebrew, there's an argument that in grammar, beginning of created God, the heavens and the earth, there's like a first and second thing going there. And even if the of is there, it could still likely mean of the heavens and the earth. Are you tracking? Zach, I think you're tracking. Did I say that in a way that I think your listeners are following?
Just what in the beginning of the heavens and the earth? Is that all you're saying?
Yeah, yeah. So the syntax is what I'm talking about. So when you get to this syntax there, some would say, now I wouldn't, that if you change or you're going to interpret the syntax of the first part that way, you would kind of also have to change the syntax of the second. So sticking with that, that's what you'd have to do in a construct, and we'll get there. But in this simple form, you're able just to kind of read it more of the way that you would read Jeremiah 26:1, 27:1, 28:1. It seems to read easier. So that's the biggest reason to kind of stick with the traditional view, is it's less arguable. Now it might be less correct, but it's less arguable. So only the scholars that have really dove into this are really going to kind of correct you. And part of that is that there doesn't seem to be a lot at stake, like I said earlier. But then you do get to kind of some scholars that are going to kind of be more vehement about it. So in a nutshell, those are the best reasons to go with the traditional take on Genesis 1 through 3. Kind of the more, this is the statement, period, stands by itself, and then explains the rest.
I was just going to sum up. It seems like you're saying, all right, the language is really awkward. And was that and obviously tradition. It's been very few people have said otherwise throughout history. So would you say those are the two big reasons?
Yeah, and even you look at all the English translations, and almost all of them go this way. I mean, there's a couple rare translations that don't. Of course, the Jewish Bible doesn't, but NRSV, UE, CEB. So to my knowledge, there's really only 3 or 4 that are going to go construct here. The great majority of them are going to translate this way. And there's a constant war that I don't know if most people are aware of, but you kind of have all the PhDs that know Hebrew over here, and then you have everybody else over here. And surprisingly, most of the people that are translating these Bibles aren't your PhD scholars. Most of the translations might have master's degrees, or the translators in the more prominent translations are those, and they don't want to step out too much. They don't want to get any criticism, so they're typically going to go traditional. But again, that would be the other thing I would say, is almost all of our English translations are going to go traditional here. So then let's look at the construct. And Genesis 1:1 is, when I say construct, again, I'll just reiterate that this is, grammatically subordinate. And so proponents here are going to interpret the initial Bereshit as not a prepositional phrase indicating an absolute beginning like you would traditionally, but they're going to look at it as a construct. So what does that mean? Well, again, like if you know Hebrew, this is pretty simple. If you don't, like, you're just going to have to take my word on some of it. Like, some of this is just Hebrew. And so, like, if you really want to understand it, you just need to have a Hebrew course and kind of go from there. But in Hebrew, nouns have 2 states: an absolute, which is kind of the normal state, and then you have a construct. And often, but not always, nouns in the construct exemplify changes in forms, vocalization. It's kind of a contrast to the absolute noun. So the construct state refers to a noun that's used in a formal construct relation with another noun. So the relation is usually so close that the two nouns together kind of make or build a compound idea. So you have to think of them as like building blocks. And that's why I started out saying things are attached on like the front of something. The best reason to go this way is that I would argue is it's the most consistent interpretation. And I thought Dr. Sun did a great job of showing that this is, if you're going to try to do consistent hermeneutical exegesis throughout the Bible, interpreting everything the same, this is where you would land. Now, the other side of the fence is going to say, well, but Genesis 1:1 is just weird. And I agree with that. That's what I've been saying. It's rare, it's different, it's whatever. And so whenever you get to a passage that is rare and different and whatever, you do have to kind of ask more questions. But one of the first rules of hermeneutics is consistency. And so taking a construct understanding of the text, in my mind, and I think almost every scholar I know would agree with me, that it's the more consistent interpretation. Now, I mentioned that really, other than the Jewish Bible, hardly any English interpretations are going to take this. The one that I'm aware of is Young's literal, and that's a pretty old one. It's an early example, but they're going to handle this as a subordinate to the beginning of 1:2. So they're going to interpret it as construct. So there are kind of tried and true people methods that are doing this. So one of the questions that Zach, you asked Dr. Sun, and he said he wasn't an expert or wasn't ready to do that. I'm not sure that I'm an expert necessarily in the history of this either, but I can give you a little eye-opening material. There were in the Middle Ages, there were two prominent rabbis that would have held this view. I think they were around 1100 AD, and rabbis kind of always went by acronyms back then, and so I'll call them Rabbi Rashi and Ibn Ezra. You might recognize those names. They're actually both pretty notable scholars, and both of them are going to take the construct position. Now, what's interesting about them is, and this is very rabbinical, so hear me here, is that almost every Jewish and definitely rabbinical source is going to go construct here. And this is why the Jewish Bible just goes construct, because for the most part, that whole group of rabbinical people have been translating or thinking mostly this way from the beginning. But the reason they do that is really not based on the grammar, although they would agree with me on the grammar, but it's really more cosmological. And so there's this assumption that the waters that are referenced in 1:2 kind of existed prior to that. And so it's a philosophical reasoning or understanding, which I actually really like, because it shows them stepping away from the text. And if we get anything from our rabbinical brothers, this is what you take away. This is, whenever I'm looking for a take away and think about the text view, I always go rabbinical, because that's what they did. They studied the text, and then they had a big group, and they sat around for hours, sometimes days, and they beat it like a dead horse. I mean, they just philosophically and logically took it from every angle. And so that's one of the biggest strengths of the construct, is that it's consistent. And honestly, when you take a step back and look at it philosophically or logically, I might say, it really tends to make the most sense. And my traditional people aren't going to like that, but I'm also going to throw the Hebrew thing in there, is that, boy, when you're reading this in Hebrew, you tend to go construct. And so as I've kind of alluded to, and these are fighting words to some, but to most, if you are a Hebrew scholar, you're going to go construct here. If you're not, you're going to go traditional. And that's what I've found years and years and years is that of debating this, researching it, is across the board. Those that have a better understanding of Hebrew go construct, and those that don't. So there's more besides that. You might think that, this could be a surprise because a lot of Jewish scholars, I would say, are very traditional. But one of the first rules of any interpretive method is how the culture would have understood it. And in ancient Hebrew, when you read this, and it kind of says God created the heavens and the earth, what it's really saying, and this is going to sound kind of crazy to you, and this is why I say it really helps in this text to know Hebrew, is because the way I would read that would be that God fattened or fulfilled or completed. So the traditional interpretation is really very Platonic or Greek biased. We have to get back to ancient Hebrew. And I would say Jesus understood this. A lot of people really get hung up on Christianity because there's these texts that say things like, be perfect as I am perfect. Jesus telling us how to live for him. And people go, well, there's no way I could live perfect. But you have to be thinking in Jesus culminated everything. He completed it. And so what he's saying is essentially, and this is such a great study. I've got a video on this on our channel if you ever want to go watch that. But what Jesus was essentially saying is, I am the completion of everything. And there's a lot of it is finished language in here going on, but I'm culminating all this. And now I want you to partner and be part of me and be with me, that I'm in you and you're a ambassador of light, that you very much represent exactly who I am, that we're going to bring fulfillment to everything. So when I kind of read these opening words and I'm thinking like a Hebrew, that's the way I'm reading them, is this fulfillment or this completed idea. So this is how the ancients, kind of the mindset that they would have had. If God has not revealed it yet, then it's not done. It's before. If God has revealed it, then it's already done. It's completed. So in the text, we want to read it platonically, I might say, as like time. We want to think everything is like a time factor. In the text, my friend John Walton says this all the time, it's not trying to teach science here, and so don't major on something that wasn't intended in the text. So what's important is the presence of God, the majesty, the splendor, the fact that he's partnering with his creation in life. And that doesn't change after the fall. That's still what he's trying to do. So when I talk about a construct view, and I say I lean this way, this is why I really lean construct, because I've spent my whole life training myself to think like an ancient Hebrew. A-N-E. That's the way that I want to approach any ancient text in the Bible, Ugaritic text, whatever it might be, is I want to put myself as if I were the intended audience. And so when you do this and then you back up and you think like the rabbis did, logically, philosophically, and I would argue theologically and exegetically at the same time, Genesis 1:1 just tends to read better in construct. It makes more sense. So when I think about this, when God started creating, he chose to kind of abdicate control. And so in the beginning, kind of doesn't describe necessarily the clarities of the origin, but the potentialities of the purpose. That's going to go all the way back to that Rabbi Rashi that I mentioned, and Aviva Zornberg writes a ton on this if you're looking for more. So there's an idea in construct that when, this is kind of what we started with, Zach, talking about the interpretation that you were asking, when is going to signify something other than time. it's going to signify the importance of God himself. And so a lot of people take the splendor of the throne here, and that's again reinforces that Deuteronomy 32 idea of God is surrounded by heavenly spiritual beings at the time, and they're not doing creating with him, but they're probably worshiping him as he is. They're on board with him, so to speak. And so that's where I kind of make some connections with John 1:1 going there. So things might not necessarily work out as we expect, the whole story of the Bible, and the same could be said for God's direct creation, the heavenly beings. But when we try to take this and make it like transcendental of God ignoring all of the spiritual beings and the partnerships going on there, it just doesn't make as much sense. So where I'm going with this is, if you didn't figure it out, construct form in Genesis 1:1 speaks to the splendor of the throne and the relational desire of God to partner with his creation.
Well said. Okay. So next question. So obviously, Robert Olmsted, he wrote this great paper that kind of explained why you can have a construct noun followed by a finite verb. Before that it's like, what? This is super weird. This is super crazy. Now the issue with that is that even though it allows you to, it makes sense in the Hebrew grammar, for a lot of people it's still very rare. It rarely happens. So, question for you: if it's so rare, why would you think that this specific situation is one of those instances when it's rare, but just from a probabilistic standpoint, it seems like this wouldn't be one of those instances?
Well, first I want to say that I'm impressed that you uncovered Homestead. That's actually pretty hard to find. So way to go there. That's a good word. I like what he did. He's done a lot of neat things. He's kind of camped out in this arena for a while, and I would say that he has some very logical, philosophical ideas, views, where I can tell that he's kind of stepped back and really thought about the text and how it connects a lot. So I don't have any major problems with his work. I really like what he's done. But that said, I would take a different view than he takes. And so there's a lot in the Bible that's rare. Anytime somebody wants to discount something because it's rare, I have a problem with. In Hebrew thinking, rare is like precious jewels. And this is biblical thinking. So we are referred to as treasured possessions all throughout the whole Old Testament. And that would be those that follow according to the way that God asks them to follow him. They're referred to as rare treasured possessions. So in the Bible, things that are rare are things that you need to pay attention to. So Hebraically, or grammar speaking, the Bible is beautiful in a way that it's going to save some rare things, particularly in poetic forms, for instances that are rare and held high. So when I'm thinking as a Hebrew, if I was the audience that was intended to read this, if I got something a whole lot of times, when you hear that a teacher has to tell you something 3 times in order for you to get it, that's Platonic thinking. That's what the Greeks have influenced us to say, that we have to get it 3 times to get it. Eastern thinking is way different than that. Eastern thinking, if a rabbi would only say something once and he whispered it, that was the most important thing. That's what you were supposed to get. And so in the same way, the Bible often speaks that way. So when I get to something that is rare, I think of it like a diamond, like a gem. I also think of it like a puzzle, because the reason Jesus answered questions with questions was because everything that had value, everything would be addressed to multiple places. I don't actually like to preach, but when I do preach, there's a thing that, and Jesus did this the best, is that I want to reach different levels. I want to reach people here and here and here and here and here. And that's why Christianity is so dynamic, because somebody that just came to Christ a few years ago might actually have the same knowledge, heart, mind level as somebody that's been walking with Christ for 20 years. And so there's something to be said in the way the Bible like hits this stuff. And a lot of that is built into the Hebrew construct that you just can't get anywhere else. And so it's beautiful. When you get to a place that's rare in Hebrew, it's whispered to you. Stop and just love the moment. Soak it in. And so this is rare, but there's a lot of things that are rare in the Bible. And so you talk about like things that are only occur once. This is again like Seminary 101, like when you find this out, hapax legomenon, that there are 1,500 words in the Old Testament that are only used one. Well, that's really like kind of a little bit of an exaggeration, because really that would be like saying running and run. Technically, those are two different words, but if I use running in a sentence and it's the only time running is used, well, I can use the root run and I can go back and find a whole bunch of different places where it was used. So really, when you get to hapax legomenon thinking, there's really only 400 of them or so in the Old Testament, but still they're rare. We don't throw them out. We glory, we revel in them, especially as Hebrew scholars. We want to really figure it out, and you have to use the lens of the Bible, what it says everywhere else, to complete the puzzle. And so that is what is going on, and they're my favorite parts. They're not the ones I hear people say, well, you can't use that, or, just put that aside because we don't know what it means. Like I say, no, that's going to give clarity to a lot of the rest of the things. Let's figure it out. So this kind of also attaches what Homestead gets into is a deeper genitive clause study, but there are, so when he says this is rare, I'm going to argue that it's not that rare. So there's approximately 200 times in Hebrew that we see this. Now, people that know Hebrew that want to hold to a traditional sense, and there aren't that many of them, but some of them might argue this, that there's not anywhere near 200, and it's a valid argument. So if you whittle away the 200, and I'm not going to get into why you would whittle them away, but you whittle them away and you say, well, how many of them, according to could you use to really identify that they work exactly the same way in construct form as Genesis 1 does? And you end up with 9 of them in the Bible. You're going to have to do some digging to find that. And if you don't know Hebrew, it's going to be very difficult. But my point is, it's not just one that the traditional camp is going to get you to think. They're trying to convince you that Genesis 1 is all by itself. It's just a super rare standalone. It's like the hapax legomenon of 3 sentences or what. And that doesn't hold water. There's at least 9 of these in the Old Testament, and they read and construct exactly the same way that we would read Genesis 1 in. So I'm actually going to tell you, I would agree with what Homestead's finishing arguments are, that I would say, and I would even go a step further, saying it's pretty bomb-proof as a history scholar to go construct here.
But off the top of your head, do you know? Do you have examples, verse citations of the 9 you're thinking of?
I can get you all 9 of those. I can give you like a little study on this too for people that want to dive deeper.
Yeah, and I'll put it on the screen later.
Yeah.
Okay, so next question. So Genesis 1:1 in Septuagint, which a lot of people would say is written 200 BC, probably our earliest text of basically a translation where we can see that the translators were trying to interpret the text essentially, and we can kind of draw stuff out of there. But they translate Genesis 1:1 as in arche, and pretty much pretty much all translators of the Septuagint would say that that's in the beginning, but also in John 1:1, it also is in arche, which is in the beginning. Question.
I'm glad you asked. I alluded to that earlier, and I was wondering if you were going to hold me to that to come back to it or not. So I'm glad you asked the question, and I think it's an incredibly pertinent question. So you start out asking do you think that's a good reason to go traditional, actually? And I would have to answer your question to say I actually think that's the best reason to go traditional. I am a huge Septuagint fan. I think that when you read, a lot of my dissertation was on how Jesus would quote the Old Testament and how to the normal person it doesn't make any sense. I can't believe more of evangelical Christianity doesn't bring this up, that you read this quote in the New Testament and you have the little reference on the sidebar and you go look it up and you're like, it doesn't even resemble it. How do you get this? And so anyway, this is it's a whole series of more YouTube videos, I think, if you want to go there. But it's an excellent question. So the original Greek is phrased, I would say, exactly like Genesis 1:1. There's no definite article that precedes arche, and it's translated also as beginning. And you might note that when the root of the Greek, you get arche again, and it's studied. You also have the same. So in it's Rishiath in Hebrew, and those are parallels. They're the same words over and over and over. So what the traditional camp is doing here of trying to say, let's be consistent. And if everybody in Second Temple period was, kind of translating it, thinking this way, shouldn't we do that too? So we have a lot of examples of this Greek word in the New Testament. And so I would say that there are 56, kind of what I was talking about earlier with the same root, but again, the running thing. But there's 12 that are almost near exact. And when you look at these 12 in the New Testament, it's really interesting. And I'm even going to I'm going to say this works with the Septuagint too, that you kind of get different interpretations. So I'll go through them with you. One is beginning or origin. That's the one we know. You also get when a person or the thing that just commences. So it's but this is a little different because it's like the first in the series. You might even call it the leader. You also, kind of have the active cause, something that kind of gets the snowball rolling. You also have, one place it's kind of seems to be like the extremity of something. Another one, and I'll pause on the extremity thing. Some people understand in Hebrew, there's what's called contronyms, and the one that you hear the most is the bless curse thing, barak, that it's the same word and it can mean an extreme one way or the other. And that's actually, kind of the way that arche is kind of translated a lot too, is it kind of has this dual meaning. But I just want to say that because some people are going to point that out if I don't. But it also has this kind of principality, rule, majesty, and that's where it goes back to in Genesis, the splendor, the throne. Now, there's also a take on this that where it just refers to spiritual beings, kind of the angel demons thing that I was saying. So it's to understand this, we know the term archangel. I'll just use that one because that's what everybody's familiar with. So it's like the same Greek word that gets attached on there. So when you look at archangel, it doesn't mean nobody really thinks that the archangel was the first angel created, but we interpret the archangel as the head or the chief or maybe the top messenger or something like that. And so within a Hebraic understanding, even to go construct in Genesis 1, I would argue that John 1:1 is correct still. And so I mentioned to you, Jeff Benner takes this view, but Genesis and John 1:1, which is the same thing. I'm going to argue that the construct form is actually better. And it's interesting, too, that Jerome's Vulgate seems to interpret this way. I don't know if you've ever looked at that before, but like it seems to go this way. So when you look at Genesis 1:1 and you kind of stay construct still, you interpret it as the chief or the most important God created the heavens and the earth. And so I could read it to you in Latin. My Latin's not very good, but it's just kind of really eye-opening to actually get the idea that when you read Genesis 1:1 and it kind of at first tends to go traditional, I would actually say that it's interpreted correctly in the Septuagint, and it still better supports a construct view than traditional when you get into the text. So I know that this is a hard one to grasp, and this is where I just come back to saying, like, it really makes sense to those that are in construct that know Hebrew and are used to thinking Hebraically, that I like hear this and I go, yeah, that makes perfect sense in construct, where the rest of the world or the rest of the camp want to read it traditionally. So it's a little bit of a head or a mindset, but I go back to, if you can only plain read in English, this is the best reason to go traditional. If you don't have a Hebraic understanding of the text, you're going to think that this supports it traditionally, but I would argue that it actually better supports it Hebraically. This is hard because what I'm saying is there's not a lot of places in the Bible where I think really knowing Hebrew helps. And boy, my Hebrew grammarian friends are going to hate me for that statement. I'm going to hear about it the day after you post this. But for the most part, with all the tools that we have, the Net Bible, the interlinear, the logos, controversy, all these things, like, I feel like the majority of the time, my 8 years in Hebrew are almost wasted compared to what you have at your fingertips right now. But occasionally, I get to a text and I go, oh, I am so glad that I have a thorough understanding of not only the Hebrew language, but also how they would have thought in an ancient Near East culture. And that's where I really come into this text, whether you're looking at Genesis 1 or you're looking at John 1:1. And I would say it's part of the beautiful puzzle and how it all fits together.
Okay, so on to Genesis 1:2. So it starts with what Hebrew grammarians call a vav disjunctive. Could you talk about what that means? We're going to have the things on the characters on the screen so people can see it themselves. But also, what is the significance of this vav disjunctive?
All right, so Zach, I believe this is a loaded question that you're asking me, because whenever you get into this conversation, essentially where people are going is that they're asking if there's any place in the Hebrew grammar for what's called the gap theory or restitution theory. You might be more understandable. Is there a place for that? Is it, you might even there's a cosmogony discussion going on too. You might need to Google that if you don't know what it is. Not cosmology, but cosmogony discussion. And it kind of touches into the Big Bang framework here. So this is a hard one. So let me do this. Genesis 1:1 presents an account of an originally perfect creation. Satan was ruler of this world, but because of his rebellion described in Isaiah 14, sin entered the universe, and as a consequence, God judged the world and reduced it to the chaotic state that's described in Genesis 1:2. And later, God is recreating it according to the description given in Genesis 1:3 through, let's say, 30:31. So you're going to see a gap here, kind of between verses 1 and 2. That's what the gap theory states. Now, you probably had a hard time even tracking with me as I was saying that, because it's logically, it's hard to wrap your eyes around. You might need to pause it, rewind it, and listen to me say it that way again. This view isn't popular anymore. I'm going to even argue it was never very popular, but it did gain some acceptance in the Scofield Study Bible, and the reference notes at the bottom, it kind of said there. I really don't like the Scofield Reference Bible, by the way. Like, we get a lot of really bad thoughts. This is kind of where, like, a lot of dispensational thoughts come from, and, bad ideas of rapture, left behind thinking, a whole bunch of other stuff. I think that the Scofield Reference Bible and Darby and all of that kind of contributed to just bad theological notions, but this is one of them. This is where it comes from. So Hebrew scholar Bruce Walton is really about the only one I know that spent any time addressing it, because I hate to say it, but most Hebrew scholars, they're not going to waste their time on this. It's a moot point. So if you're really interested, if you're thinking that this holds any validity, I would say go spend some time with Bruce Waltke, and that stuff's probably older than I am. But let me just kind of give you a summary. Essentially, the view would hold that Genesis 1:2 describes the destruction of creation, like I said, by some evil cataclysmic event. Most people would say that's the fall of Satan. It happens between Genesis 1 and 2, and there's a gap of time. And so 100 years ago, you had people that believe that. Today, I honestly, I don't know of anybody that takes this seriously, certainly not any scholars and even regular people. You might get some evangelical church people that are still stuck in a Scofield Reference Bible and are reading it for the first time and just want to share things they find creative, but those don't last very long. And so, in a nutshell, the theory doesn't work Hebrew grammatically. And I could, kind of get into this significantly, like Zach alluded to. There's a kind of wa disjunctive beginning in Genesis 1:2, and the Hebrew conjunction wa prefixed to a noun instead of the verb, which that's just automatically, it's going to take away or mar any kind of narrative sequence going on there. So you're not going to find somebody that knows Hebrew or that's a grammarian, that's at least not new to Hebrew anyway, that's a grammarian, that doesn't work. So the wa disjunctive, it just, when we see it in 1:2, it just forbids any kind of linear sequence of events. So essentially, in Hebrew, there's not even a consideration. It doesn't hold any water. And again, I don't know of any Hebrew scholar that's going to go there.
So basically what you're saying is the gap theory doesn't work because in Genesis 1:2 at the beginning, it's, Genesis 1:1, it's like whether, something like in the beginning God created and the heavens and the earth, and then it's like, but Genesis 1:2 is kind of like a side comment. Is that what you're saying? That's basically what it does?
Now, like any other theory, there are different versions of the gap theory. So I think it's important to say that not all gap theory people are going to hold to that. So there is a more modern sense of the gap theory that isn't going to necessarily go with this space between Genesis 1 and 1:1 and 1:2 as much as just being a gap somewhere. Now, I actually think that this can hold water. So let me give you an interpretation of this. And I'm not necessarily saying I believe this or this is my view, as much as I'm saying I'm open to it, like it could make sense. And the reason why you'd want to go there, and this is why I started out by saying some people need the text to do something for them. And so people that want scripture to really scientifically agree, and I would actually argue that most of the time it does. There's very a few places where it doesn't, is that, as you know, a lot of science is going to date the actual Earth to be, let's say, millions of years old, and young Earth creationists are going to be strongly opposed to that. And let's say 4 to 12,000 years. Those are the extremes. Let's just say 8,000 years. If you're going to hold 8,000 years, well, how can you be a young Earth person and believe even 8 or 12,000 years and make sense of the science that says that they've unraveled some of the Earth to be this old? Now, some people would say there's two ways to look at this: that perhaps God created it as if it was already aged. That's viable. I can see that. Another part would be to say, well, what if there is seemingly a gap somewhere in creation? It doesn't necessarily have to be between 1 and 2. So this is where I'd say not all gap theorists are going to say the 1 1 1 2 thing. There's going to be gap theorists that are going to say somewhere in the creation, and you could put this gap in a lot of different places. An amount of time goes by that we just simply don't have recorded in the Bible. And again, like, the Bible is not trying to be a science book, so it's trying to convey its main message of God's continual love to people that continually walk away from him, and that he still has a plan for them. And the plan that was broken in the first pages of the Bible is regained in the last pages of the Bible, and everything in between is just a mess. And so God wants to continue this partnership that he started on the first pages, and he works through all the muck and makes a plan for that. But in order to do that, maybe it's just not recorded that there's a gap someplace in there. And a lot of people are going to put that gap. A lot of people that do this might even put the gap later than that. So you might not be familiar with this, that when you're looking at the a conversation comes into this with the pyramids. And so you kind of say the pyramids came from Egypt. Egypt is in Hebrew Mizraim. That's one of Noah's sons. Yet when you do the math that the world says the pyramids are this old, and then you get into the genealogies of the Bible, they just barely don't line up. And how could these pyramids would seem to take all this time to build, yet in the Bible, when you look at archaeological dating as the chronology of the Bible, there doesn't seem to be enough time to build the pyramids. I realize this is a big squirrel, a big wild goose chase I'm going down, but just hear me out for a second. So when you're looking at the dating of the pyramids, is it possible, but there was more time in there than we necessarily get? So with the pyramids, there's this thing where you get these rulers and they want to stack them all on top of each other, when there might have been two rulers ruling at the same time. There was less overlap. We don't know exactly how long their reigns ruled, things like that. So there are viable explanations, but some gap theorists, I'm saying all this to just show you that some gap theorists are just going to put gaps at different places, and sometimes more than one, to make sense out of the Bible and make it more agreeable with science. And I don't discount that. I think that you have to have valid reason to do that. But again, if it points to God, I'm actually okay with it when you see things like that happening.
Awesome, good stuff. Okay, so to continue, let's go to... okay, yeah. So you talked about, what this disjunctive does in Genesis 1:2, but how do we know that that's what this Hebrew word or add-on or whatever? What is it? How do we know that that's what it does? How do scholars come across this meaning?
So when you were asking me where are the 9 constructs? Well, I can and would give you the 9, but it's not going to help very many people. And the reason it's not going to help is because you wouldn't know the difference of the 200 or the 9 that I gave you. You have to thoroughly know your Hebrew to understand these things. So if I put 200 of them on the shelf and I said, now pick the 9 that really hold water, and we had 20 Hebrew scholars in there, they wouldn't all arrive at the same 9. Are you following? It's difficult. So this is a place where Hebrew can be simple or it can be tough. So let me say it like this. The theory assumes that the and, which introduces verse 2 and 3, are identical in meaning, and that both have the idea of sequence, the and then. But then you kind of get to the conjunctions introducing verses 2 and 3, and they're a little bit different than the original text. The law introducing the verse 3 does, in fact, kind of denote sequence. So it's called by grammarians the law consecutive. Now, when you get there, introducing verse 2 is different both in form and function. So this is a conjunctive. So the conjunctive may introduce various types of clauses, but it doesn't introduce an independent sequential clause. That's really the best way to say it. And again, like, that probably meant nothing to most people listening. I kind of went through all that. It's just nerd language. Again, like I'm speaking Greek, but it's Hebrew. And so you're not going to get it. And this is where, like, even people that are tracking, so even like Dr. Sun listening to me saying that, well, he would track what I just said. I mean, he pretty much said that the same too. But it's difficult. So let me help you out with this. Essentially, some passages with the law consecutive are viewed as narrative, but not necessarily historical. So that's where some of this is going. So poetry is kind of where you get this. Psalm 18 is a good example of this. But we also are going to get it in 2 Samuel 12 and maybe Judges 9, 8 through 15. Trying to think of any more. There's others. But those two examples, you're looking at clearly history. So the argument comes into play of narrative versus myth. And this is really why when you get into a disjunctive, conjunctive argument in Genesis 2, 5, and 6, you could even kind of get into this a little bit too, is it myth? That's where, that if people are asking this question, that's where they're headed. So Genesis is poetic, but it's also historical narrative as opposed to just myth. And so there's going to be a lot of people, there's going to be a lot of people that want to read Genesis as just myth, like, like the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Iliad and the Odyssey, that, it's good fun reading, it was passed over lore centuries and years, but it really never happened. Well, most evangelical Christians, they can't do that in Genesis. They're going to say, our Bible doesn't treat it as myth. Our Bible treats it as historical narrative, but it can be poetic at the same time. And that's been my argument if you're tracking. And boy, I realize that I don't know what minute we're in this video, but most viewers, watchers have probably left because you gotta know a little bit of Hebrew to hang on here. And this is just one of these that, like, the Bible treats all of these historical, so you should be treating this part of the text in the same way you would treat everything else. And again, that was one of the major premises of Dr. Sun, and he did get into some of this and try to show you some of that. So I'm not going to beat a dead horse with it, but just kind of share more along the same lines.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Okay, so Genesis 1-2 at the very beginning, different translations, it's like, now the earth was, and the...
Yeah, you were alluding to this earlier, and I didn't quite answer your question all the way, I don't think.
I was just going to ask you, like, it seems like, 1-2, a lot of times they start it like it is, it's its own independent clause, but other people translate it as something like a dependent clause. So, like, why do people do it differently?
So in Hebrew, all of those are viable. And this is where people really get hung up is this is what I was talking about. Like if I wasn't familiar with Genesis 1:1 and you handed me a Hebrew Bible and you said, "Here, can you translate this for me?" When I would first start, I might start by saying, "Okay, now the earth was, well, hold on, and the earth was, where's that but the earth was, or the earth was and but." You see what I'm saying? Like I would be like trying to figure out how to tell you what this says in Hebrew. So, to answer your question, the answer is simply yes. All of these are options, and you would think they're all viable options in Hebrew, but when you really study it, some of them are going to be more viable than other. So, we kind of talked about this earlier with prepositions. So, this is the fun part about Hebrew. It is that puzzle I mentioned earlier, you have to figure it out. It is in English, and this is one of the problems with Americans is like we think the Bible was written in English. Like we want everything to make sense in English, and we don't care about the poetic parts of it or anything like that. And there is so much in Hebrew that I just say gets lost in translation that I'll often be reading something in Hebrew while a friend's reading it in English, like at a sermon, and I'll start laughing, and like people will look at me and like roll their eyes and be like, "All right, where's the joke? What's going on?" And I'll be like, "Oh, there's just a little rhyme, a word play that was cute," and Jesus does this all the time, and like I just think like, oh man, we're missing this. Like some of the best things in the New Testament are these little puns and word plays that nobody else gets, and I'm just sitting there laughing to myself, and they're almost unexplainable. Like you can't really explain it to somebody that doesn't know Hebrew, and so I kind of go back to it and go, you just kind of have to figure it out. So this is one where I intentionally avoided your question the first time, Zach, and I'm going to intentionally avoid it again of saying this is just kind of a Hebrew language thing that like it's hard to translate over. Especially when you get to prepositions, they can just mean a lot of different things. You can interpret it differently, and this is where any rabbinical studies, it's so important. This is the step back and logically think through it is how does this line up with the rest of the view of Scripture? And that's why people that are into Hebrew are jumping all over the text. They're asking, does Ezekiel line up with Genesis? Which sounds ridiculous. Why do they have to? But that's an A&E ancient Hebraic better way of thinking in the Old Testament.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, that's fair enough. Okay. So, I mean, did you want to do Trinity stuff right now? Just a couple of
Yeah.
questions.
Let's go
All right,
at
cool.
let's go at it.
All right. So, yeah. So you mentioned Elohim. Anything else you wanted to add on that one?
So I got into it a little bit, and we could get into the grammar, although you're going to have to kind of get to a place where you either get it or you don't get it, and there is an understanding here that I think most scholars just kind of easily accept. There's so the easiest way to say this is there's no real contradiction in the text. And that's what I think a lot of people are wondering is does this work? And so going back into an understanding of was the Trinity in the first pages of Genesis, most Hebrew scholars are going to vehemently defend that the Trinity isn't in the opening pages. Now that sounds funny to most people, and Dr. Heiser might explain this better than I do. If you want some good understandings, he's got like a PowerPoint thing on YouTube that walks through this, but he's also got some other stuff on his podcast that he's touched on it a couple times. But essentially, people that want to see their ancient Near East eyes, if you believe that the text was written, as John Walton would say, it was written to a specific audience, but you might glean from what was said to that audience. If you believe the Bible works that way, and again, most of my Hebrew friends, my scholars, are going to work that way, you're not going to have much room for the Trinity here. And the reason is because you don't have much room for the Trinity anywhere in the Old Testament. Now, there is perhaps a better, like, binarian view that they kind of might say Yahweh 1, Yahweh 2, that there's an understanding that there might be a spirit or another sense. And so you read like angel of the Lord passages or the Spirit of God passages and things like that. And if you only had the Old Testament, you would immediately get the idea that there seems to be two presences that exist. And so that's where you're going to go. Now, when you say Elohim in the opening words, does that mean that he's talking to the other presence, to Yahweh 1, Yahweh 2? Now, could that be Jesus? Could that be the Holy Spirit? Yes, yes, and yes. I'm not sure that we have all the answers to that. We're gonna find out, someday. Could it be a divine council that he's talking to? I think that's very relevant, as I said earlier, a very good point. Could it have meant the Trinity? Now, nobody in the Old Testament would have read it that way. So one of the first laws or textures of interpretation, you might say, is how would they have read it? Would they have gotten this out of it? And the answer is no. Now, there's also the idea of progressive revelation, and a lot of traditionalists don't like that things are going to be said for a later, people think of this prophetically sometimes, but things are going to be said that's going to make sense later. Could the Trinity be that kind of progressive revelation that Jesus would be giving fruition to that later? And you can think that way. I don't have a big hang up or a big problem with that. So I have a lot of scholarly friends that are going to hold more of my view of saying there's not really much room for that, and why do we need to interpret it that way when a better interpretation is simply just to say the us meant somebody else. It meant Yahweh 1, Yahweh 2, whether you think that's Jesus or the Holy Spirit or something like that. But without the New Testament, and this blows people away, but without the New Testament, it's you wouldn't find the Trinity in the Old Testament. Now, some people take the Trinity and they go back and they say, oh, there's 27 verses in the Old Testament that show or they prove the Trinity. And that's not really good Hebraic thinking, I guess, is the best way to say it. You can think that way if you want to, but I would say that the way scholars typically think, which I think is, in terms of biblical studies, a better way of thinking than what your average consumer, layperson, even pastor might take on. A PhD way of thinking doesn't need to have the Trinity represented in the opening pages. In other words, we don't really gain anything by saying that the Trinity is there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But obviously, a lot of people or a lot of scholars have said, like, hey, Genesis 1:1, the word bara is singular, so that means that Elohim should be singular. Do you disagree with that, or you agree? It seems like you're kind of open about it.
Grammatically, it's okay that they disagree. And so essentially what the best interpretation of that, I can't remember who uses this analogy, but they use the pizza party analogy. It might be Heiser, it might be Walton, I can't remember. And I don't want to put any words in anybody's faces, but I'm borrowing the analogy, I guess is what I'm saying, is that they would kind of be looking around at each other, and let's say that, kind of per my lingo earlier, that God says, okay, let's get together and have this pizza party. And so everybody gets together and he says, let's do this. But when you come over to God's house, it's God that is actually making the pizza or ordered or paid for the pizza or something like that. It's him that's doing the actual creating, and everybody else is kind of just there for the party. And maybe they're giving glory to him as he's doing that, but there's no doubt that the creating, it's I'd even say unarguable in the language that it's God, the singular Yahweh Elohim, that is creating, but he's bringing a party with him to honor, bless, oversee whatever else is going on. So in my mind, there's not a problem in the grammar between them when you're thinking that way. But again, that's thinking more like a Hebrew and less like a Greek to understand it that way.
Gotcha. Okay, very last question. The wind, the Spirit of God. Obviously a lot of people are going to think that's the Holy Spirit. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that it could be possibly the Holy Spirit. So I'm going out on a limb here. As long as we're talking about the things your pastor never, the discussions they wouldn't have for you, you hang around with people that think the way Zach and I think, there's not a bad question. So there's almost a sense that if you're truly pursuing the Lord, nothing's heretical to at least entertain the thought. And so one of these thoughts is to think more binarian, like I said, that there's just two, the kind of the Yahweh 1, Yahweh 2. And some people believe almost every Trinitarian view or perspective, but they think when it says the Spirit in the Old Testament and the Spirit in the New Testament, that oftentimes, not every time, but oftentimes, you can have God and he's just going to simply give his spirit to something. So when you're in that spirit, you're in the same spirit that God would have. You see this also in the New Testament with Jesus giving his spirit. And there's some people that are going to take a view that in the Old Testament and beginning of the New Testament, primarily up until the crucifixion / ascension, that you're still only dealing with two L's, that you're only dealing with two Yahweh God types. And so what happens at the ascension is we see Jesus sitting at the throne. Now that in this conversation, as I've been talking throne room, sacred space conversation, that should tell you something when Jesus sits down at the throne. And it says he sits at the right hand of God. So now you have God and you have Jesus. But what does Jesus do at Pentecost? He sends his spirit. So we've always interpreted that as the third person. But what if you're just interpreting it as Jesus's form of the Spirit in the same way that we often tend to get God's Spirit in the Old Testament? Now, I still consider myself a Trinitarian, but I'm open to these views. Like, actually, this isn't that far off from most evangelicals' Trinitarian concepts. It's just going to define the Spirit of God and the Spirit of Jesus a little bit differently. So I say all of this to say that you can interpret the Spirit hovering or whatever you want differently. It's not really affected Hebrew grammatically most of the time, but you can logically or philosophically take many different understandings that could work within the text. So this is one that I kind of turn back over to the viewers and say, like, chew on it for a little bit. Like, it's actually a pretty interesting thought that I don't think most people entertain very much, is why are we so Trinitarian? And is that necessarily what the Bible teaches? In the Old Testament, I would almost entirely hold to a Yahweh 1, Yahweh 2 view or Spirit of God view more so than a Trinity view. But I do believe in the New Testament that there's too many references that would seem to indicate a Trinitarian understanding, particularly of who is sent as a counselor, etc., from Jesus, that it seems to be more than just the spirit or the idea or the personification of Jesus, but it acts as a separate person. So to me, I would say I feel like something happens at the cross and the ascension. This is going to get into atonement theories as well. I'm a more leaning Christus Victor, although with Scott McKnight, I think a lot of them have a place in terms of like a golf club and a golf bag. I have use for a few different theories there. But personally, I'm going to say that something happens at the cross and the ascension, and I'm pretty sure that all of our Trinitarian views are going to be affected by that. Now, I don't have it all figured out, as you can tell, but I'm open to some of those ideas and some of those thoughts. I think it's a positive way of thinking theologically through the Old Testament and the New Testament.